In the dusty plains of Texas, where the wind carried whispers of distant wars and the sun baked the earth into resilience, a boy named Joseph Stiborik grew up quietly. Born to Czech immigrants, Joseph was the embodiment of modesty. His family had come to America seeking opportunity, and they found it in the form of hard labor, community, and the promise of freedom. Joseph was not a loud child. He didn't crave attention or chase glory. Instead, he was drawn to machines, radios, wires, anything that hummed with electricity. He had a natural curiosity, the kind that made him take apart his family's radio just to see how it worked. His father, a stern but loving man, encouraged this curiosity, even if it meant living without music for a few weeks. Despite his fascination with technology, he faced a challenge. He was colorblind. In an era when such a condition could disqualify someone from many roles, especially in aviation, Joseph didn't let it define him. He learned to adapt, to rely on patterns and logic rather than color. It was this quiet determination that would later make him indispensable. As the 1930s gave way to global unrest, Joseph watched the world change. Europe, the land of his ancestors, was descending into chaos. Hitler's rise, the invasion of Poland, and the spread of fascism were not just headlines, they were personal. Though he was American by birth, Joseph felt the weight of his heritage. He knew that war was coming, and he knew he had to be part of the solution. In 1942, with the United States now fully engaged in World War II, Joseph enlisted in the Army Air Forces. He was 28 years old, older than many of his peers, but his maturity and technical skills set him apart. He was assigned to radar school, a relatively new and secretive branch of military training. Radar was still in its infancy, but its potential was enormous. It could detect enemy aircraft, guide bombers, and change the course of battles. Joseph excelled. He wasn't the fastest or the loudest, but he was precise. He understood the nuances of radar waves, the importance of calibration, and the need for absolute focus. His instructors noted his calm demeanor and his ability to work under pressure. He didn't seek praise, he sought perfection. In 1944, Joseph was selected to join the 509th Composite Group, an elite unit formed for a mission so secret that even its members didn't know the full details. The group was part of the Manhattan Project, the U.S. effort to develop atomic weapons. Joseph's role would be as a radar operator aboard a B-29 bomber. He didn't know where he would fly or what he would drop, but he knew it mattered. He was sent to Wendover Army Airfield in Utah for training. There he met the men who would become his crew, including Paul Tibbets, the pilot who would later command the Enola Gay. The crew trained relentlessly, practicing long flights, emergency procedures, and radar operations. He spent hours in the belly of the plane, surrounded by wires and screens, learning every nuance of the equipment. In early 1945, the crew was transferred to Tinian Island in the Pacific. The island was a hive of activity. Thousands of soldiers, endless supplies, and a sense of urgency. The war in Europe was ending, but Japan remained defiant. The U.S. needed a decisive blow, and the 509th was preparing to deliver it. Joseph didn't ask questions. He focused on his radar, ensuring it was calibrated, tested, and ready. He knew that his job was to keep the skies clear, to guide the plane, and to ensure the mission's success. He didn't know that he was about to be part of the most consequential flight in human history.
His silence wasn't ignorance, it was discipline. Joseph understood that some things were bigger than one man, and that his role, though quiet, was essential. He didn't seek the spotlight. He sought precision, clarity, and duty. As the sun set over Tinian and the Enola Gay stood ready on the runway, Joseph Stiborik sat in his station, surrounded by radar screens and humming wires. He was ready. The world was about to change, and he would be there, not in the headlines, not in the photographs, but in the silence that made it all possible.
By the time Joseph Stiborik completed his radar training, the world was already deep in the throes of war. The Pacific Theater was a cauldron of violence, and the United States was racing against time to end the conflict. Radar, still a relatively new technology, was proving to be a game changer. It allowed bombers to navigate with precision, detect enemy aircraft, and maintain communication in hostile skies. For Joseph, it was more than just a job. It was a calling. In 1944, Stiborik was selected for a top-secret assignment. He was transferred to Wendover Army Airfield in Utah, where a new unit was being formed, the 509th Composite Group. This group wasn't just another bomber squadron. It was part of the Manhattan Project, the clandestine effort to develop the world's first atomic bomb. The men of the 509th were hand-picked. They were told little about their mission, only that it was of utmost importance. Joseph, with his quiet demeanor and technical expertise, fit in perfectly. He didn't ask questions. He focused on his radar systems, ensuring they were flawless. The secrecy didn't bother him. He understood that silence was sometimes the most powerful form of service. Training at Wendover was intense. The crews practiced long-range flights, emergency procedures, and bomb-loading drills. Joseph spent hours inside the B-29 superfortress, learning every wire, every dial, every flicker on the radar screen. He knew that in the chaos of war, clarity was everything. One missed signal could mean disaster. The B-29 was a marvel of engineering. Faster, higher flying, and more heavily armed than any bomber before. But it was also complex. Radar operators like Joseph were essential to its success. They guided the plane through enemy territory, avoided anti-aircraft fire, and ensured the bomb reached its target. In early 1945, the 509th was deployed to Tinian Island in the Pacific. Tinian was a strategic base, just 1,500 miles from Japan. It was here that the final preparations for the atomic bombing would take place. The island buzzed with activity. Engineers, scientists, and military personnel working around the clock. Joseph arrived quietly, as always. He set up his radar station, calibrated his equipment, and began running simulations. He didn't know the full scope of the mission, but he knew it was historic. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was being assembled nearby. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The atmosphere on Tinian was surreal. The crew of the Enola Gay, the B-29 selected for the mission, trained in secrecy. They were told they would be dropping a special device over Japan. The target, Hiroshima, a city of military significance, but also home to hundreds of thousands of civilians. Joseph didn't speak much during the briefings. He listened, took notes, and returned to his station. He knew that his radar would be the eyes of the mission. If enemy fighters approached, he would be the first to know. If the plane veered off course, he would guide it back. His role was silent, but vital.
In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, a different kind of mission was taking shape in the Pacific. The 509th Composite Group, stationed on Tinian Island, was preparing for something unprecedented. At the heart of this operation was a single aircraft, the Enola Gay, and a crew of men whose names would be etched into history. Among them was Joseph Stiborik, the radar operator whose quiet vigilance would help guide the most consequential flight of the 20th century. The Enola Gay was a B-29 Superfortress, a marvel of wartime engineering. It was faster, more durable, and capable of flying at altitudes that made it nearly untouchable by enemy fighters. But this mission wasn't about dogfights or bombing runs. It was about delivering a weapon that could end the war in a single strike. The crew was hand-picked by Colonel Paul Tibbets, a seasoned pilot known for his precision and leadership. Tibbets would serve as the aircraft commander. His co-pilot, Robert Lewis, was a skilled flyer with a deep sense of duty. The bombardier, Thomas Farabee, was responsible for releasing the bomb. Navigator Theodore Dutch Van Kirk would chart the course. Flight engineer Wyatt Dusenberry kept the engines humming. And then there was Joseph Stiborik, the radar operator, tucked away in the belly of the plane, surrounded by screens and wires. Each man had a role. Each role was critical. But Stiborik's was unique. Radar was still a relatively new technology, and its operators were often overlooked. Yet without radar, the Enola Gay could have flown into enemy territory blind. Stiborik's job was to monitor the skies for Japanese fighters, ensure the plane stayed on course, and maintain radio silence throughout the mission. The crew trained together for months. They flew practice runs, simulated bomb drops, and rehearsed emergency procedures. They learned to trust each other, not just with their lives, but with the weight of history. The bond between them was forged in secrecy and sharpened by purpose. Stiborik was quiet, methodical, and deeply focused. He didn't engage in the banter that filled the mess hall. He didn't seek camaraderie for its own sake. But when he spoke, his words carried weight. The crew respected him not for his volume, but for his precision. Inside the Enola Gay, the layout was tight. The radar station was located behind the cockpit, surrounded by humming equipment. Stiborik spent hours there, calibrating frequencies, checking for interference, and running diagnostics. He knew that in the chaos of war, clarity was everything. One missed blip on the radar could mean disaster. The crew was briefed repeatedly, though the details of their mission remained vague. They were told they would be dropping a special device over Japan. They were instructed to maintain strict radio silence and to expect a massive explosion. The target? Hiroshima. As the day of the mission approached, the crew gathered for final preparations. Tibbets reviewed the flight plan. Farabee studied the bomb's release mechanism. Van Kirk double-checked the navigation charts. And Stiborik, as always, returned to his radar station, running one last check. On August 5, 1945, the Enola Gay was loaded with Little Boy, the uranium-based atomic bomb. The crew was given their final orders. They would take off in the early hours of August 6th, fly to Hiroshima, and drop the bomb. The flight would be long, the stakes immeasurable. That night, the crew shared a quiet meal. Some joked nervously, others sat in silence. Stiborik, ever composed, ate slowly, his mind already on the radar signals he would monitor. He didn't speak of fear or glory. He spoke only of frequencies and calibration. As the sun rose over Tinian, the Enola Gay stood ready. The crew climbed aboard, each man taking his station. Tibbets in the cockpit, Farabee at the bomb controls, Van Kirk with his charts, and Stiborik, surrounded by screens, ready to guide them through the silence.
Tinian Island, a speck in the Pacific Ocean. had become the nerve center of one of the most secretive operations in military history. By mid-1945, the island was transformed into a sprawling air base, housing thousands of personnel, dozens of aircraft, and the final components of a weapon that would forever alter the course of humanity. Among the men stationed there was Joseph Stiborik, quiet, focused, and ready. The 509th Composite Group had arrived months earlier, bringing with them the B-29 bombers and the classified mission that few understood in full. The island buzzed with activity. Engineers worked around the clock assembling the bomb. Scientists from Los Alamos moved discreetly between hangars. Military police guarded every entrance. The air was thick with tension and secrecy. Joseph Stiborik spent his days inside the Enola Gay, calibrating radar systems, running diagnostics, and preparing for a flight unlike any other. His station was tucked behind the cockpit, surrounded by humming equipment and flickering screens. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His job was to ensure that the plane could navigate safely, detect any threats, and maintain radio silence throughout the mission. On August 5, 1945, the final orders came down. The target was Hiroshima, a city of military significance, but also home to hundreds of thousands of civilians. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was ready. It was a uranium-based device, the first of its kind. Its destructive power was theoretical, but terrifying. That afternoon, the bomb was loaded onto the Enola Gay. The process was meticulous. The bomb was wheeled out of its storage bunker, lifted by a hydraulic hoist, and carefully secured in the bomb bay. Only a handful of men knew what it truly was. Most thought it was a new kind of explosive. Few understood that it was a weapon capable of vaporizing a city. The crew gathered for a final briefing. Colonel Paul Tibbets reviewed the flight plan. The route would take them over Iwo Jima, then across the Pacific to Japan. They would fly at 31,000 feet, maintain strict radio silence, and drop the bomb at precisely 8:15 a.m. The weather over Hiroshima was expected to be clear. Stiborik listened intently. He didn't ask questions. He didn't speculate. He simply noted the coordinates, the timing, and the radar protocols. His role was clear: monitor the skies, guide the plane, and ensure that nothing interfered with the mission. That evening, the crew shared a quiet meal. Some joked nervously. Others stared at their plates. The weight of the moment was beginning to settle in. They knew they were about to do something historic, something irreversible. Stiborik sat alone, reviewing his notes. He checked his equipment one last time, ensuring that every dial, every frequency, every wire was in perfect order. He understood that radar wasn't just about detection, it was about precision, and precision was everything. As night fell over Tinian, the Enola Gay was moved to the runway. Ground crews performed final checks. The bomb was armed. The engines were primed. The crew climbed aboard, each man taking his station. Tibbets in the cockpit, Farabee at the bomb controls, Van Kirk with his charts, and Stiborik, surrounded by screens, ready to guide them through the silence.
At precisely 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island under the cover of darkness.
The engines roared, the runway blurred, and the mission that had been months in the making was finally airborne. Inside the aircraft, the crew settled into their stations. Each man knew his role, each man knew the stakes, and in the belly of the plane, surrounded by radar screens and wires, Joseph Stiborik began his silent vigil. The flight to Hiroshima would take approximately 6 hours. The route had been carefully planned to avoid enemy radar and fighter patrols. Stiborik's job was to monitor the skies, detect any incoming threats, and ensure the plane stayed on course. His radar console flickered with signals, each one a potential danger, but the skies were quiet, eerily so. The crew maintained strict radio silence, no chatter, no updates, just the hum of the engines and the occasional check-in between stations. Stiborik's eyes scanned the radar, his hands steady on the controls. He was looking for blips, signs of enemy aircraft, interference, anything that could jeopardize the mission. But the Pacific was vast, and the silence stretched on. At 7:09 a.m., the bomb was armed mid-flight. Captain William Parsons, the weaponeer, entered the bomb bay and completed the arming sequence. The crew watched in silence. They knew that from this moment forward, they were carrying a live atomic weapon. The mood shifted. Jokes faded. Eyes narrowed. The weight of history pressed down. As they approached the Japanese coastline, the crew began final preparations. Navigator Theodore Vankirk confirmed their position. Bombardier Thomas Farabee reviewed the release mechanism. Pilot Paul Tibbets adjusted their altitude, and Stiborik, ever quiet, confirmed that radar showed no enemy aircraft in the vicinity. At 8:15 a.m., the Enola Gay reached its target. Hiroshima lay below, a city of military factories, barracks, and civilians beginning their day. From 31,000 feet, it looked peaceful. The sun glinted off rooftops. Streets bustled with movement. But peace was an illusion. The bomb bay doors opened. Farabee took aim. He said, "Bomb away." The plane lurched as Little Boy dropped. The crew banked sharply to avoid the blast. Stiborik's radar confirmed no interference. The skies remained clear. And then the flash. A blinding light erupted below. The shockwave hit the plane, rattling the fuselage. A mushroom cloud rose over the city, towering into the sky. The crew stared in stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. They had seen explosions before, but nothing like this. Below, Hiroshima was engulfed in fire and destruction. Tens of thousands perished instantly. Buildings vaporized. Shadows were burned into walls. The city was transformed in seconds. The mission had succeeded, but at an unimaginable cost. Inside the Enola Gay, the crew remained silent. Tibbets stared ahead. Farabee looked down. Vankirk adjusted his charts. And Stiborik, his eyes still on the radar, continued his scan. His face was unreadable. His hands never trembled. He didn't speak. He didn't react. He simply did his job. The plane turned and began its journey back to Tinian Island. The crew remained quiet. They had just witnessed the birth of a new era, one defined not by victory, but by devastation. The silence inside the aircraft was deafening. Stiborik continued to monitor radar until they were safely out of Japanese airspace. He logged the signals, noted the absence of enemy fighters, and ensured the plane stayed on course. His work was precise, methodical, and invisible. But without it, the mission could have failed. As the Enola Gay flew over the Pacific, the crew began to process what had happened. Some felt relief.
Others felt guilt. Most felt nothing. Not yet. The enormity of the moment was too vast, too sudden. It would take years to understand, decades to reconcile. But Joseph Stiborik didn't seek understanding. He didn't seek recognition. He had done his job, quietly, efficiently, and without error. He had guided the most consequential flight in human history, and he had done so in silence.
August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m., the moment that split history in two. From 31,000 feet above Hiroshima, the Enola Gay released its payload, Little Boy, the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonating 1,900 feet above the city. What followed was not just an explosion, it was a transformation of reality. Inside the aircraft, the crew braced for impact. The plane banked sharply to avoid the shockwave. A blinding flash lit up the sky, followed by a concussive force that jolted the fuselage. The mushroom cloud rose with terrifying speed, towering over the city like a specter of destruction. Joseph Stiborik, seated at his radar console, confirmed what his instruments already told him: no enemy aircraft in the vicinity. The skies were clear. The mission had gone exactly as planned. But the silence that followed was unlike anything he had ever known. The crew stared out the windows. Below them, Hiroshima was vanishing. The blast incinerated everything within a 1-mile radius. Buildings were flattened. People were vaporized. Fires raged across the city. The temperature at ground zero reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. No one spoke. Pilot Paul Tibbets kept his eyes forward. Bombardier Thomas Farabee stared at the cloud. Navigator Van Kirk adjusted his charts, and Stiborik, ever silent, continued to monitor radar. His hands moved with mechanical precision, logging data, scanning frequencies, ensuring the plane remained undetected. But inside, something shifted. Stiborik had trained for this. He had calibrated his equipment, studied the flight path, and prepared for every contingency. But nothing could prepare him for the sight of a city consumed in seconds. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply watched and listened to the silence. The Enola Gay circled once, then turned back toward Tinian. The crew remained quiet. They had just witnessed the birth of a new weapon, one that could end wars, but also end worlds. The enormity of the moment was too vast to process. It hung in the air like radiation, invisible, but inescapable. Stiborik's radar showed no threats. The skies were empty, but the silence was not peace. It was the absence of everything. No radio chatter, no enemy fighters, no sound from the city below. Just the hum of the engines and the weight of what had been done. As the plane flew over the Pacific, the crew began to speak, slowly, cautiously. Some expressed relief. Others tried to rationalize, but Stiborik said nothing. He didn't offer opinions or emotions. He simply continued his work, logging signals, adjusting frequencies, and guiding the plane home. He understood that his role was not to judge, it was to execute, and he had done so flawlessly. But flawless execution did not mean emotional immunity. The silence he carried was not just professional, it was personal. The bomb had changed the world. It had ended a war, but it had also begun a new era, one of fear, power, and silence.
And Joseph Stiborik, the radar operator who guided the mission, carried that silence with him for the rest of his life.
The Enola Gay touched down on the runway at Tinian Island at 2:58 p.m., August 6, 1945. The flight crew had just completed the most consequential bombing mission in human history. As the wheels screeched against the tarmac and the engines powered down, the silence inside the aircraft lingered, heavy, unspoken, and irreversible. Ground personnel rushed to greet the crew. Officers, scientists, and photographers surrounded the plane, eager to document the return. Colonel Paul Tibbets stepped out first, greeted with handshakes and congratulations. One by one, the crew followed. Smiles were exchanged. Phrases like "mission accomplished" and "well done" echoed across the airfield. But Joseph Stiborik didn't linger. He exited quietly, his radar logs tucked under his arm, his expression unreadable. He didn't seek the cameras, he didn't speak to the press. He simply walked toward the operations tent, his mind still processing the silence he had carried across the Pacific. Inside the tent, the crew was debriefed. They described the flight, the drop, the shock wave, and the mushroom cloud. Scientists listened intently, jotting down notes. Military officials asked about enemy resistance, aircraft performance, and bomb behavior. Stiborik reported no radar interference. The skies had been clear. The mission had gone exactly as planned. But the questions that lingered weren't technical. They were moral. What had they just done? What did it mean? Could anyone truly understand the weight of vaporizing a city? For Stiborik, the answers didn't come easily. He had done his job with precision. He had monitored the skies, guided the plane, and ensured the mission's success. But success was a complicated word now. It meant victory, yes, but also devastation. In the days that followed, news of the bombings spread across the globe. Hiroshima had been destroyed. Tens of thousands were dead. Japan was reeling. The world was stunned. And the crew of the Enola Gay became instant legends. Photographs of the crew appeared in newspapers. Interviews were conducted. Medals were awarded. But Joseph Stiborik remained in the background. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't attend ceremonies. He returned to his station, continued his duties, and spoke little of what had happened. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The atomic age had begun. Tinian Island, once a hive of activity, began to quiet. The 509th Composite Group prepared for redeployment. The Enola Gay was inspected, cleaned, and eventually sent back to the United States. The crew dispersed, each man returning to civilian life with memories that would never fade. Stiborik left the military quietly. He settled into a modest life, working in electronics and raising a family. He never sought fame. He never spoke publicly about the mission. His silence was not avoidance, it was reverence. He understood that history was not just made by those in the spotlight. It was shaped by those in the shadows,
the technicians, the operators, the quiet professionals who ensured that missions succeeded. His radar had kept the skies clear. His vigilance had guided the flight. His silence had honored the lives lost. And so, as the world moved forward, Joseph Stiborik remained a silent witness to history. Not forgotten, but rarely remembered. Not celebrated, but deeply respected by those who knew the truth.
After the war, the world changed rapidly, irreversibly. Nations rebuilt, alliances shifted, the atomic age had begun. But amid the headlines in history books, one man returned to civilian life without fanfare, without interviews, and without a single public word about the mission that changed the world. Joseph Stiborik, the radar operator aboard the Enola Gay, faded into quiet anonymity. He left the military with honor and humility, settling into a modest life in Texas. He worked in electronics, raised a family, and lived without seeking recognition. While others from the mission gave interviews or appeared at commemorations, Stiborik remained silent. Not out of shame or secrecy, but out of reverence. He understood the weight of what had happened. He had seen the mushroom cloud rise over Hiroshima. He had watched a city vanish from 31,000 feet. He had guided the most consequential flight in human history, and he had done so with precision, discipline, and silence. In the decades that followed, the world debated the ethics of Hiroshima. Was it necessary? Was it justified? Could there have been another way? Historians, politicians, and survivors all offered their voices. But Joseph Stiborik never joined the conversation. His silence became its own kind of testimony, a quiet acknowledgement of the complexity, the tragedy, and the burden of history. He passed away in 1980 at the age of 66. There were no parades, no documentaries, just a quiet funeral for a man who had once helped end a world war. But his legacy endures, not in headlines, but in the radar signals that guided the Enola Gay through the skies, in the silence that followed the blast, in the understanding that history is not only shaped by those who speak, but also by those who listen, who act, and who carry the weight of their actions with humility. Joseph Stiborik was not a general. He was not a scientist. He was not a politician. He was a technician, a radar operator, a man who did his job with excellence and never asked for applause. And perhaps that is what makes his story so powerful. Because history is not just made by the loudest voices, it is also made by the quiet hands behind the scenes, the ones who calibrate the instruments, monitor the skies, and guide the course of events without ever stepping into the spotlight. Joseph Stiborik was one of those hands, and in his silence, he spoke volumes.